Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. In the name of God, the merciful, the giver of mercy. Welcome to Darwinian Delusions. My name is Hamza, this is brother Sabur, and I want to ask Sabur a bunch of questions today. So, Assalamu alaikum, bro. The first question I want to ask is this. The Darwinian mechanism to explain biological change is currently the most well-established theory to explain the disparate data that we have, the data that we have, right? No one's really denying that per se. But the question I have is this. Why is there such a huge gap between those who popularize the Darwinian mechanism as an explanation and the discussions in academia? Why is there a gap? Why is there sometimes a disconnect? Because mashallah, we've been watching your videos, we've been seeing your interactions, and you haven't said anything that is incongruent with academia. You said exactly what academia is talking about, that there are alternatives, there are some gaps, there are some things that we still need to explain, and all of these things. So my point is not really a scientific or philosophical one at the moment, it is really a sociological one, which is, why is there a gap between the popularizers and the discussions on an academic level?
Okay, that's a very good question. And it goes back to a statement which Richard Dawkins made decades ago. In The Blind Watchmaker, he said, although before Darwin it was possible to be an atheist, but Darwin allowed us to be intellectually satisfied atheists. Now, imagine if there is a theory out there, a theory which is really dovetailing with Islamic theology. Now, we as Muslims, we are more likely to adopt that theory, we are more likely to popularize that theory, we are more likely to speak about that theory. And say if tomorrow, if somebody came up with some contentions to that scientific theory, we would defend it in spite of the evidence because it seems to dovetail with Islamic theology. Simply because, even though we shouldn't do that, it's just human nature to support that which is in line with your worldview. And we're not blaming them for that, we're just showing a reality, which is that they admit that Darwin's theory of natural selection dovetails with their conception of the world, naturalism, and hence why they, one, overstep the evidence, two, they unnecessarily attack those in academia who challenge that theory on scientific grounds.
So what you're basically saying is it's more of an emotional, ideological driving force that is basically making them not represent what's really happening in academia.
Yeah.
Do you think there's any other reasons why these popularizers are basically, pronouncing the Darwinian mechanism as this kind of set of Moses tablets?
Well, what I want to do is I want to sort of put it in the way that some evolutionary biologists have come forward. So Lynn Margulis, a very famous evolutionary biologist, an atheist, a secular academic. Now, she wanted to sort of expose this sort of difference between the public perception and what's actually going on. And she called Darwinian evolution an Anglo-Saxon religious sect.
Oh my God.
Right? James Shapiro, another evolutionary biologist from Chicago University, agnostic, speaks out against creationism, intelligent design. He made the statement that the way that these popularizers come across, they would never academically speak to me like that. And likewise, we have people like Masatashi Nai, another important evolutionary biologist from Japan, another atheist, and he basically said that Darwin is a god in biology. He doesn't believe in the Darwinian mechanism, he believes in an alternative. And he says that whenever you have this dogma, you actually have to challenge it. Now, I believe one of the reasons why they have this sort of monopoly in terms of the narrative, not in terms of academia, but in terms of the narrative, is because if they show, or if it is shown to the public that actually it's not written in stone, it may be the best they have, but it's not written in stone, then that will render all of their narrative for the last 150 years, it'll show cracks in their narrative. And I think what that will do is it'll create a sort of crisis amongst the public, because the public will say, but hang on guys, you said this is true, this is absolutely true, it's as true as gravity. And if you remember, when you had a conversation with Richard Dawkins in Ireland in 2011, he mentioned to you that, well, it's the same as the planets orbiting the sun, right? And in the same conference, he didn't want people to study the philosophy of science.
Yes.
So you can see there's an ideological sort of backing. It's like a safety net. If you imagine there's a circus, right? You have a safety net at the bottom. On the top, you have a tightrope with people doing, all sorts of gymnastics. If they happen to fall, there's the safety net. The safety net is naturalism. So there's a whole philosophical worldview behind this.
For people who don't know, naturalism is a worldview that everything can be explained by physical processes, and that there is no supernatural and there is no divine.
Yeah.
Okay, so just for people to know. So there's this naturalistic safety net. And it's quite interesting you said that, because I just finished my MA in philosophy, and I did my thesis, my dissertation on physicalism, which is somewhat related to naturalism. Physicalism is the view that everything could be reduced to physical processes or physical stuff, and there's a kind of they also use the word materialism and physicalism as the same thing these days, although they have two different histories and they have slightly different nuances. But generally speaking, in academia, if you hear physicalism and materialism, even sometimes naturalism, they mean sort of the same thing. Things can be explained by physical stuff, physical processes. So the thesis was on physicalism and the philosophy of the mind. And I got frustrated too, although this has nothing to do with the Darwinian mechanism. I got frustrated from the point of view that all of these popularizers saying, look, consciousness is just reduced to the brain, and you have this kind of atheistic, naturalistic, physicalist understanding of what it means to be a human being, i.e. being conscious. And yet when I went into academia, and obviously you have to be a little bit more nuanced on this level, I was like, what are they talking about? There are no absolutes in this position. In actual fact, when you have this kind of neuromania, as Professor Tallis calls it, Professor Tallis is an atheist, this neuromania that they believe that, your subjective inner conscious states can be reduced to just firings in the brain or some kind of neurochemical happenings, that itself is a false assumption, because what neuroscientists are saying, or those who adopt a neuromania, that consciousness is just what's happening in the brain, they're basically saying that subjective consciousness and physical stuff is identical. And that's not a scientific question, it's a philosophical assumption. So the whole of neuroscience is based on a philosophical assumption. And
that's a consensus.
Yes, and that philosophical assumption is a form of physicalism. It could be, for example, emergent materialism, it could be reductive materialism. We don't have to discuss these terms, but the point is, it's based on that assumption. And in order for neuroscience to progress, they have to start talking about philosophy, because I could look into your mind and find neurochemical pathways and trying to correlate to some, phenomenon, which means soft inner subjective conscious state. Fine, I've correlated it, but it doesn't mean it's the same thing. For you to say it's the same thing, you're now adopting a philosophical baggage and assumption that physicalism is true. So this whole neuromania, some people come across as, this is absolute. You have the likes of Sam Harris and others,
who you said wasn't actually a reference point in neuroscience. Which most people, the first neuroscientist they think of is...
Well, in the philosophy of the mind, I studied at a good institution, University of London, Birkbeck College. Sam Harris wasn't mentioned once. Even when I did the specialist module of philosophy of science, Richard Dawkins was only mentioned, I think, in a joke. And I'm not saying that, I'm trying to be humble here. I'm not saying, oh look, they don't know what they're talking about, they don't have credentials. Of course they have. But what I'm trying to say is that sometimes we have this sociological construct in our minds that just because people are always seen on YouTube or TV and they write books and they have some credentials, fair enough, and they're very loud, it means that they represent everything that's happening in academia. But once you get into academia, you're like, well, that's not really the case. So I share that, I empathize with that view.
And at the end of the day, whether it's philosophy of mind or it's Darwinian evolution, it's the same fundamental thing we're speaking about here. It's the naturalistic understanding of nature, which is given as if that is the only understanding possible.
Well, naturalism itself is a metaphysical position. What I mean by that is you have to adopt naturalism in order to understand the world. You don't look at the world and the world is telling you it's just physical stuff. Yeah. Because that would be unfair, and you want to be academically nuanced either. Like Professor Michael Ruse, who's an atheist, he's a philosopher of science. He basically says that if he has to make a concession, that naturalism is a faith.
Yeah.
It's the lenses in which you put on your eyes in order to see the world.
Yeah.
Yes, it may be coherent in some aspects, but there are some recalcitrant facts, which are facts that resist the thesis of naturalism. What are these recalcitrant facts? For example, you have the issue of the hard problem of consciousness, inner subjective conscious states. You have the problem of language, if you follow a view that language is innate. You have all these other problems. You even have problems in biology itself. Coming back to your point though, talking about assumptions. Now there's this new kind of growing new area of philosophy called philosophy of biology, right? It's relatively new, right?
30 years.
30 years, yeah. What assumptions does the philosophy of biology have?
Okay, that's a very good question. Now, one thing which we need to realize when it comes to a new field is because there's so much little work done on it, and in fact, when you mention philosophy of biology, some people ridicule it. It's like, is there even such a field? It's not actually a completely coherent system at the moment because there's so many problems which they haven't even clearly defined. But just to give you one of the assumptions is that all of the physical world, physical biological world, can be explained in naturalistic terms. So Richard Lewontin, he's an academic, an atheist academic at Harvard, he basically said, what we have to do is we have to have an a priori assumption that everything can be explained naturalistically. And those explanations are Just So Stories, and Just So Stories is Rudyard Kipling's book, children's book, which I'm sure your children might have heard of. That, you know, you get the elephant, and the elephant has a long snout. So how did it get that? There was an alligator which tugged it, tried to tug it into the river, and you get this very long thing. This is a childish story. So he says, in biology, we have Just So Stories. We have counterintuitive narratives. We have things which just do not make any sense. But he says, we have to accept this on the a priori basis that this is the only thing possible, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. So that is one of the fundamental assumptions. Now, one of the most interesting aspects of philosophy of biology, when I started reading on this topic, something which I found really, really interesting is biologists are, if you imagine they're studying organisms, right? And they are studying how they evolve and how they change and whatnot. Now, for the philosopher of biology, his study organism is the biologist. So he's staring at the biologist, how's he making his conclusions? And one thing which I found refreshing was biologists have been speaking about, evolutionary biologists especially, have been speaking about the tree of life as a truism. It's just roses are roses. It's just the tree of life. And when you pick up a book from, for example, Princeton University Philosophy of Biology by Peter Godfrey Smith, he speaks about the tree of life as a construct. And he says, by the way, there's other constructs, web, this, that, and you're like, wow. A biologist would never speak like that. So one of the refreshing aspects about people like Peter Godfrey Smith, and also another publication, Evolution and Evidence by Cambridge Elliot Sober, you know of him.
Well, in actual fact, Elliot Sober and Godfrey Smith, we have them as part of our reading list for the postgrad.
Yeah. I mean, I'm guessing they're involved in other areas of philosophy as well. Now, one of the things he does with common ancestry, universal common ancestry, is he treats it as if it's a completely open hypothesis test, and he pits it against separate ancestry. And what he basically goes on to show, and when I first came across this, I literally could not believe what I was reading, because he's an atheist and this is a mainstream publication. What he concluded is all you can say about universal common ancestry is that it's based on a probabilistic framework, which has multiple assumptions, some of which can be challenged. And there is absolutely no absolutes in this. And when you read something like this, and all your life you've been hearing that, you know, it's true, it's just, it's not something that's even up for doubt, then you basically understand that philosophy of biology is a field that needs to be highlighted a lot more.
So from that point of view, I think we could conclude that there is a gap between the popularizers and what's happening in academia. And I think for, you know, Muslim audiences, when they should be encouraged to do science and they should be encouraged to study different areas of knowledge like mathematics and physics and chemistry and arts and English and whatever, right, history and philosophy, but they shouldn't fall for the trap that when they're on the path of this type of knowledge, that they get consumed and overwhelmed by the very loud noises and the evangelicals of, for example, naturalism and physicalism, right? And they should understand and take advice from yourself that there is such a gap between the nuances in academia and the differences of opinion and the assumptions and the philosophical assumptions and the challenges and all of these things and what the loud voices are actually saying.
Yeah.
And I think it's your job, bro, and it's many other brothers and sisters and whoever they are, people who want to get involved in this, it's their job to basically expose that gap. In actual fact, when I was discussing with my thesis supervisor, I said to him, why is there such a big gap between the popularizers, and he's an atheist, he's a physicalist, and he agreed, yes, there is a gap. And he said actually the British government, our government, wanted to fund people like himself, academics, to close that gap, to represent what is really going on. Because someone can sound really, really smart, bro, and we've all been victim to this, you know, and you know, we're all on a journey, but you can sound really, really smart, say a few nice, clever words and a few references, and you could come across as you've got the truth, and this is the absolute, you know, period, end of story. This is exactly what the truth is about this fact, about this thing. But when you even study a bit further, you think it gets very, very grey. And that's why from an Islamic, even theological, spiritual perspective, Muslims shouldn't be worried at all. I mean, you have this belief that you have this spiritual, innate, and also intellectual conviction in the divine and in his book and in the message, and then you have this construct that, fine, it's the best that we have to explain the data at the moment, but it can change, there are assumptions, and there are alternatives, right? So we should just basically turn down that kind of worry knob. You know, sometimes we get really worried, oh my God, there's this new theory that's gonna, you know, annihilate all religious discourse. It's actually not really true, because when you study the reality, it's totally different. So just to end, summarize to us the kind of, obviously, you know, the Darwinian mechanism is the most prominent one at the moment in academia, because it's what you would call the most well confirmed from that point of view. It explains probably most data than other, maybe alternatives. I don't know, I haven't studied it, you have. So we're not really saying they're wrong in an evangelical way. What you're saying is, don't come across as if you're absolutely right about this issue and represent what's going on, which is there are challenges, assumptions, and there are all of these things going on. So just explain again why the Darwinian mechanism is not a set of Moses tablets.
Okay, just to give you a sort of picture, Darwin said, and so has, I mean, most people don't know about people like Henry Gee. He is the senior editor of the most prestigious journal in the world. So if you like, it's the Premier League, right? And he's the top guy there. They both have said, and it's on record, that if there was no fossils, Darwinian evolution would still be true, from the perspective that they just have classification. So what we need to understand is this, and even recently, you know, they found the footprints before we were supposed to have the ability to walk by a few hundreds of thousands of million years. So the story from that perspective is true. But when a new thing comes, they'll just reinterpret it. So what we need to understand is this. When scientists are working in this particular field and they're coming up with different constructs and different theories, and they keep changing them over time, we need to understand that there's assumptions behind this thing. Now, I want to give an example which sounds like a crude example just to end with, but it's not, and it's really not. And I have actually tested this out before. So if I said to you, human-chimp ancestry is true from a scientific perspective, right? True as in, you know, we have some reasons to believe it to be true in terms of an assumption and whatnot. And then I was to say to you equally the same thing, but I would say to you the chimp-pig theory. What would your initial reaction to that be?
Well, if you told me there was a chimp-pig theory, which I assume is that a chimp somehow mated with a pig,
yeah,
and then as a result
created the human line.
Created the human line.
Yeah.
I would think it's a little bit of a joke.
Okay, but what if I was to then add something which there's nobody who could challenge that, is that both the pig-chimp and the human-chimp ancestry is based on the exact same assumptions. So epistemically, they are the same way.
Okay.
So scientifically, they both could be considered facts.
Okay, but why do they go against the pig-chimp theory?
Well, the thing is, it's kind of like when you and this is where Kuhn comes in, right? You have, if you like, an infinite amount of data, and you have finite number of experiments. It's kind of like you sometimes have to pick and choose. So some evolutionary biologists, they don't accept even the pig chimp. They try to explain what other evolutionary biologists can't explain in terms of the human pig similarities, using another theory called the aquatic ape theory. So at the end of the day, the reason why I highlight these examples, even though they fringe, the pig chimp and the aquatic ape, is purely to show the fact which Henry Gee points out earlier on in his book, in terms of he draws out this, he has this scattergraph type picture and a few random fossils, and he draws a line, then he draws another line, then he draws another line, and he says you can draw an infinite amount of lines and they are all epistemically equivalent.
This reminds me of epistemic holism when we studied this in the philosophy of science, which is based on this idea that you have different theories that all connect with one another in some way, and that there's a web of beliefs, if you like, and if you change the assumptions, you could fundamentally change your understanding of reality. To the point where the academic, when he was teaching this, he basically said, if you change the assumptions enough, you could try and show that the universe was a pancake. He probably said that as a joke, but what he was trying to say is that if you follow this epistemic view on science, on the philosophy of science, that there is no absolutes, because there's all these webs of beliefs, and if you tweak some assumptions here and there, you could have a fundamentally different approach to reality. So this is quite similar, because you're talking about understanding the human line, and there are different theories. You have the ape-pig theory, you have the aquatic ape theory, that he fell off a tree, went into the sea or something.
But by the way, I think what we should end upon is the guy who came up with the aquatic ape theory. He was someone who did not believe in God, not religious at all. He was an academic, and he sat on that theory for almost 30 years. He didn't publish it because of academic pressure. Because when he did actually publish it, he did get some support. And interestingly, even though he's not an academic, but he's a popularizer, David Attenborough, he does subscribe to the aquatic ape theory as well. They held on to that, he held on to that theory for 30 years simply because he thought he was going to be ridiculed. Now, which goes to show what we began off with, is that there is this pressure, there is this difference between the public understanding and the way that science is actually pursued. And this is, if you like, one of the narratives which we need to get out there, which is that study more, because there's a huge difference between what you know and the way that science is actually done.
Totally agree. As John Stuart Mill would say, that in the kind of clash of ideas, the truth will prevail, and that's why you shouldn't allow popularizers that are evangelical and they could seem quite intimidating to stop you from articulating a different position or bringing into light what is really, really happening. So, good conversation, bro. Jazakallah khairs. To summarize, brothers and sisters, there is a gap between academia and popular discourse. And when you understand what's happening in academia, then you realize that popular discourse is not a set of Moses tablets. So let's chill. Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah.